Okay, there we go. We are recording and ready to go. Okay, Jared's still wrapping up. All right, well, let's wait just a minute or two, let people filter in, and then we'll get going. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get going. We've got a few things on the agenda, so we can just jump in and people can filter in as they finish up with Jared's deal.
Okay.
Let's see. Debrina, are you here? I think I see you. Yes. So first thing on here is your question about Cheerio.js.
Right.
How to approach this without knowing jQuery.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. Sorry, I was having some audio problems.
Yes, no worries. Mm-hmm.
I got linked.
So I was seeing you had a question about Cheerio.js about like how to approach studying it, or
Yeah, so I'm doing the IMDb scraping benchmark, and in the specs, there's an ask to use the required Cheerio.js to, I guess, extract the HTML and text out of the data that you get. And I read the docs, and I'm doing a jQuery video now, but I'm not really familiar with jQuery at all, actually. So did you have any suggestions, videos? The docs on Cheerio.js weren't really explicit about what the hell. And I'm completely feeling very insecure about using it, and I don't know where to start. Do I start where I am, like just, hey, take this time to learn jQuery so you can do Cheerio.js? Is that a thing?
Yeah, so Cheerio is so jQuery is a client-side library. Like, it was built to use in the browser. And Cheerio takes like a subset of that functionality and is designed to work like on the server side in your node process. So I don't know how helpful it is to start with jQuery, just because you might be covering a lot of stuff that isn't even included in Cheerio. I think for this, what I might say is you might just start by focusing on like what is it that you need to use Cheerio to do in the benchmark, and then sort of go specifically into the docs in Cheerio and figure out how to do just that piece. I don't know if it's worth your time to like learn a whole bunch about jQuery and then learn everything about Cheerio. It might be more helpful to just like start with the pieces that you need to be able to use for the benchmark. Do you have a sense of like where in the benchmark goal you're going to need to use Cheerio, or is that part of what you're trying to figure out, like why you even need this library and what it's for?
So I have some understanding of why I could use Cheerio.
Mm-hmm.
Like I've gotten the type of information, at least if I understand the type of information that I need to get using Cheerio with like inner HTML and inner text. But I guess this is a lot more, I don't know, compact and rigorous, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, have you done that on the server side yet?
No.
That's part of the difference. Like, when you're manipulating HTML on the server, you're in a little bit of a different environment, where in the browser, you have this DOM object that's just available. It's there, it's global. And you can start doing things like inner HTML, and it'll start searching the DOM object, because there's always some HTML page that you're sort of inside when you're executing JavaScript in the browser. But when you're writing an app that's not running in the browser, right? You're just like going to scrape a page in a script and then try and parse HTML just in a node script. You need some way to turn that big string of text that is the HTML into some sort of object that you can manipulate and search through and do things like, find element by ID and then look at inner HTML.
And I have a quick question about what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
So just going along with this jQuery video I'm watching, they say that jQuery turns HTML elements into objects.
Mm-hmm.
And I suppose since Cheerio is utilizing jQuery, that it's accessing these objects and manipulating them as objects as well.
Yeah, Cheerio's not using jQuery. Think of it as a competitor to jQuery, right? Like jQuery is Burger King and Cheerio is McDonald's. It's a separate thing that's filling a similar role.
Okay.
So they both provide similar functionality. It's just that jQuery, when you use jQuery on the server side, the way that it's implemented, just from the little bit of reading that I've done, makes it slow, and it's got a bunch of features in it that you would never use kind of on the server side. And so Cheerio is sort of a more focused, lightweight library that provides very similar functionality to like the core parts of jQuery, and is sort of optimized to run on the server and be very fast.
Okay.
So, and that's why I don't I'm not sure in the literature around Cheerio, you're going to see a lot of stuff about jQuery because it's like, hey, Cheerio's the new jQuery. It's better, it's faster, it runs on the server. But I don't know that you necessarily need to go and dig in real deep into jQuery docs as like a starting place, just because that's what Cheerio is kind of replacing. Looking through the Cheerio docs, it looks like they have decent documentation on the functionality that it provides. And every once in a while, they will sort of link to the jQuery docs because they're sort of implementing the same functions with the same interfaces. Let me think of a good way to do this. Let me share my screen. Share. No. Okay. Let's do this. Let's install Cheerio and pull up the docs. So probably, I think, is this it? This is it. My guesstimate is that if you can get kind of an idea of the role that Cheerio is going to play in your app you're writing for the benchmark, then I think probably just the documentation on this like Cheerio page, either in their GitHub page or on their cheerio.js.org, which is just another version of the same documentation, will probably be all you need to do what you're going to need to do. So I'm just gonna, let's see, yeah, this will work. So let me just require so much typing. Just gonna copy their little example here. So the idea here is that, you're, what's the name of the benchmark you're working on? Is it the IMDb?
Yeah,
one?
it's the IMDb one. I think
Gotcha.
it's like movie search is the name of it.
Gotcha. So as part of that benchmark, right, you're going out, you're making an HTTP request, and you're downloading, you're downloading the HTML from a page on IMDb. So you're going to come to a point in your application where you're going to have IMDb page. You're going to have that IMDb page as just a string with a bunch of HTML in it, right? Kind of like what they've got here. You'll have some string of HTML, but it'll be the whole page, right? From HTML tags all the way down.
So you mean like assign the body that you receive back to that const?
Right. Yeah. You're gonna have it like in the body. It's gonna be like in the parameter and the callback to the request that you're making, right? So yeah, this will be like body, I guess, probably. doesn't matter what it's called. HTML. So let's say we had like a full-on HTML page. And somewhere in there, there's going to be, I forget exactly what the IMDb page looks like, right? But let's just say that like it's a list, right? So there's going to be this list of like results, right? Movie 1. And there's probably, I don't know, a bunch of those. Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. Right. So anyway, there's a bunch of these movies, right? And so Cheerio is just going to make it easy for you to like parse this HTML into some sort of JavaScript object, very similar to the DOM that you would have in the browser, so that you can start like searching for stuff. And what it does, which is very similar to what jQuery was created to do, was give you a really consistent, clean way of like navigating through a document object model in a lot easier way than like the built-in browser JavaScript functions give you. So you just take that body and you pass it to Cheerio.load, and you're going to get back this function, which by convention, they usually name $. You can name it anything you want. But it's just a function that lets you like search for stuff in that body using CSS selectors, right? So that's sort of like, that's really all you need to use Cheerio to do, is just like take a string HTML, pass it to load to get back this little function. And then you can use that to do searches using CSS selectors. And there's a handful of other methods for sort of traversing the document that are documented on this page. I'm trying to think. I mean, honestly, this is probably all you're going to need is something like this, right? So you're looking for like, if you just wanted to get all the LI elements, you could do that. And then maybe get the text. See if this is even going to be close to working. If I run this, if that's even close. He's very upset with me. Oh, this can't be multi-line. JavaScript. There we go. So we'll start, printing these things out.
Okay, that seemed relatively simple.
Yeah, does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Mm-hmm.
When you said that Cheerio.load body would return this little function, like it returns a like, I don't understand what you mean by that returns a function.
So yeah, it returns a function. So Cheerio.load, the return value of this is, we're naming it $, but we could just name it I'm going to call foof right now, just to be clear. It looks funny when you stick it in a $, but it was really just, it's a thing that the function is returning.
I see.
And the value itself, just, like you could pass a function to a function, you can also return a function from a function. And so that's what Cheerio.load it's doing. It's returning a function that you can pass basically CSS selectors to, and it will search this document defined in the body. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
I got it.
Yeah. it's a little quirk of JavaScript that you can name that $ is a valid variable name.
Mm-hmm.
And jQuery sort of started that convention of like, oh, we'll just name this function $, and then like it'll be less typing.
Okay.
So, yeah. So probably that would be a more appropriate way to do that. But yeah, I think does that kind of give you sort of more tactical idea of like where you need to use Cheerio and.
Yeah, that's exactly how I thought it was supposed to be used, but then the syntax tripped me up, and I was a little confused about how to chain. I was like, are we going functional? What am I doing? But just seeing it done and having you talk through it, my tensions are resolved. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Great. Let's go back to the agenda. Okay, so Jonathan, you had 2 questions in here about fixture factory and faker and writing factory functions. You want to talk a little bit about that? You may be muted.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, so basically, I was really interested in really kind of like diving deep on some of this testing stuff, and I came across this useful technique basically where you're using factory functions to generate data for yourself in one contained object, and using that fixture data basically, because I guess that's what test data is called. It's called a fixture. So it generates those fixtures and then uses the fixtures in the test, and then you destroy the object afterward. Just, I guess, so you're writing a self-contained test every time. So I was kind of just those 2 libraries as an example, like maybe if you could pull the docs up and kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about. But Deb was kind of showing me over here like how to just write your own factory function to do something similar with Faker.js. And I was just kind of wondering if you could run through some of this stuff and maybe like how you would approach maybe building stuff for a test or or writing a factory function to do so.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So usually most of my experience using like fixtures and factories in tests comes from doing testing database related code where you're sort of creating you're like inserting a bunch of stuff into the database, right? So you're going to do some tests. So you need to like add a couple users to the database and a blog post and whatever, so that you can test the path of your code that where a user might make a comment on a blog post, right? You actually have to create the user and the blog post in the database before your test starts, so you have some data to work with. And because in a lot of test suites you end up doing that sort of thing often, there are some libraries for like making that easier. And the one that I'm most familiar with in JavaScript is actually called Factory Girl, not Factory Girl Rails. There's a Factory Girl for Ruby too. So sometimes when you're searching, you gotta make sure you get the right one. Let's search for JavaScript. That's the one. So here we go. So Factory Girl is kind of like what you're talking about. It's a fixture generator, but it does a little bit more in that it will actually create the fixture and insert it into the database for you. So that's the contents I'm like more familiar with doing this in Faker. And the other thing you mentioned, what was it? Fixture Factory. Are sort of like one layer peeled off of that, where they're just ways for you to sort of create realistic looking sample data, which could be something that you need to do in tests, even if you don't have a database. And so I haven't actually worked with, I've worked with Faker just a tiny bit. And
I
I've
believe
not
that's
worked with,
the, I'm sorry to interrupt.
yeah.
I believe that's the Java version that you have pulled up Fixture
Oh, it
Factory.
is, isn't it? I did that last time too. There it is. There we go. That looks right. Yeah, thanks for that. So I've used Faker just a little bit. I haven't used Fixture Factory before. I just kind of scanned over the notes when I saw this in the agenda, or scanned over the docs a little bit. And I can go through this a little bit, you know, just sort of learn as I go. But I guess I want to make sure that I'm
So I'm not
addressing
really,
what is helpful. Like, what is it that you're?
I'm not really
about here?
attached to the library.
Mhm.
I mean, it doesn't have to be Fixture Factory. I'm
Mhm.
more interested in just getting to learn a library that does something similar. So I mean, I'm totally cool with Factory Grow as well.
Gotcha. Are you?
It's just the one that I picked that I was just researching on my own. So
Sure. Yeah, and are you trying to get an idea of like how you might use this kind of a library in your tests and like what purpose it serves, or just like you sort of have a handle on that and are just wondering more specifically like how to use, you just want to like learn a library to do that?
pretty much, I just kind of want to pick a tool and be able to use it well. And I'm really just kind of like more interested in like how do you keep your tests so that they don't so that they're self-contained. You know what I mean? So that you're always getting a fresh object and destroying that object. So it's just like it's just good practice from what I've read. So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's look at that a little bit. Just make sure that I've got. Let's see, Faker. Let's just install this stuff. Fixture Factory. Fixture Factory. Okay, so let's get some tests here. Get some of those. Okay, so trying to think of a good example of some code where you would need this type of thing. So in the, I think it's the phase 1 curriculum, there's this, can't remember now if it's a benchmark or just a module. I think it's a benchmark. There's this contacts. Where is it? Foundational. 321 contacts, where you're sort of writing these functions. Where's the file? Can use. There it is. File. So if you got these functions stubbed out, I don't know if you've worked through this example or if you started in phase 2.
Yeah, I've worked through these. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So right. So it's you've got add contents, print contents, and you've got this. So you've got these functions that are sort of manipulating this, you know, big data structure. They're expecting just some big kind of data structure to come in. And so, you know, if we assume we were writing tests for something like that, right? So say we're writing tests for add contacts. So we'll probably have a test here that says, you know, can add lots of contacts. And so we might want to say add contacts, and you know, pass in a bunch of contacts, which we could do this way, right? We could just we could hard code in our file right here a bunch of fake data. And that would work, right? but it kind of requires us to sort of like type out all this stuff, right? In reality, we'd probably get lazy, and all of these names would be something like name 1, name 2, name 3. So something like Faker, let's go look at the docs for Faker. So something like Faker, yeah, that's about it. Faker equals require Faker. And this is the test, so I probably have some sort of expectation on it. Expect. And maybe just for simplicity, we can say that like our add context, we're just going to expect that it returns the number of contacts that were added, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4, there's 5 of these. Let's just say that we expect this thing to return 5. Just for the purposes of having some kind of a test here. Right, so I'm just going to implement the add context function down here. A real simple version just returns. Okay, so then we should at least have some tests here that are passing. What do I want to do? Node modules, bin, mocha, this file. Expect is not defined. Well, that's true. Const expect equals required chai. Okay, so we got a passing test. So the first thing we could do to make this easier with something like Faker is replace these like names and email addresses with just sort of like randomly generated ones. They're realistic looking. So, you know, Faker gives us this Faker object that has all of these sort of nested methods on it for generating different types of things. So there's an internet section in here somewhere, internet, where we can generate avatars and email addresses and example emails and usernames and all kinds of stuff. So we could, instead of this, say internet.email. And we could do that for all of these, right? That one, that one, that one, that one. And maybe just so that we can see what's going on here, I'll just log out the contacts when add contacts is called, so we can see what's happening in the tests. So this should give us a bunch of like realistic looking email addresses, right? jasonryan55@hotmail.com. So all these sort of like realistic looking email addresses that we didn't have to come up with ourselves. And each time we call faker.internet.email, we get a different email address, which is handy. And then somewhere in here, we should be able to get names. First name and last name are options, apparently. So we should be able to change this to faker.name.firstname. And then faker.name.lastname. Come back down here and do these other ones the same way. So, right, so now we have all this like little generic, this generic list here, and our test should still look the same. If we run contacts, we should still see we're getting, yeah, sort of realistic looking data and all these things. So Faker sort of helps us with that. So that can be useful in a test. What I would actually say is that I actually tend to dislike randomly generated data like this in tests, because in general in tests, you want your test suite to be doing the exact same thing every time it runs. So if you're testing how a function behaves on a certain input, you want to pass that exact same input every time that test runs. You can imagine, say we had some weird bug in our contacts module such that email addresses over a certain length caused an error, right? Or first names over a certain length caused an error. So if we said contacts, if we look at first contact dot name, first name dot length is greater than, let's call it 10. So say that we had some bug in our application, and this is just simulating it, right? But say we had some bug in our application that caused an error if the first name was more than 10 characters, right? We're trying to save it in a database column that wasn't wide enough or something like that, right? That's not what I want. I want to be here. In this case, we can run our tests. Can't read properly length of undefined. Well, that's not helpful. Contacts 0 first underscore name. There we go. So the test passes that time. But if I keep running these tests long enough, chances are eventually that Faker is going to come up with a first name for the first contact that's more than 10 characters long. And so you'll end up in a situation where your tests pass most of the time, but every once in a while, because of some way the data changes, your test fails. And those kind of failures can be really, really hard to debug. Your test suite's just going to fail, and you're going to go, I have a failing test. But then when you run it again, the test will start passing again. It can be really hard to figure out why it failed in that aberrant case. And so random data in your tests can just end up causing a lot of headaches. If you have a test suite with 400 tests in it and it starts having intermittent failures, it can be really hard to track down why it's failing intermittently. If you have a lot of places in your test suite that generate random data that's different on every test run, you don't have like a repeatable experiment to run. So that's my caveat about using Faker. In a lot of cases, it's not a bad idea, and this would still be useful for something like mocking out an API endpoint for testing. But in general, you want to be kind of leery of random data in your tests. I've spent a lot of time fighting with intermittent test failures caused by random data that seemed harmless at the time, but then it turned out that if the date happens to be too far away from a certain day, then things start to break, and it can just be tough for that sort of thing. But caveats aside, let's keep going on this for a minute. So assuming that this isn't going to be a problem, well, actually, let me slow down. Does that make sense? Why random data might be problematic in your tests?
Yeah, it does.
Okay.
The fixture, I guess the reason I picked Picture Factory is because it actually has a dependency, a Faker dependency in it.
Yeah.
So it has some methods built in for I see what you're saying. You wouldn't necessarily use all of the methods, but I believe they give an example of their one where they use a random number that you can use the Fixture Factory, I guess, kind of just controls for the actual test part. I guess that's where it comes in, is how I understand it. But
say that again.
Basically, Fixture Factory kind of uses Faker to help it generate some fake data where it needs it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's kind of what, like, you can use Faker just all by itself to generate random data like this, right? What Fixture Factory does is add sort of a layer on top of that to make it even more convenient. So one of the things that that's sort of suboptimal about this test is that, like, we have this, what is this, like 25 lines of code that isn't doing much of anything interesting, right? It's just creating 5 different sort of user objects, right? With first names and last names and email. But like these 5 lines are just repeated over and over and over again. And if we wanted to do more tests for add contacts, we'd have to repeat them there. And so what Fixture Factory lets you do is, let's import that and look at that real quick. Fixture Factory. Fixture Factory. That's right, isn't it? Nope. I thought that was wrong. So this is going to let you define sort of generators to, you know, like Faker will let you generate random individual strings, but it won't let you, but it, you know, it's not going to give us a convenient way to generate this whole object, right? That has, you know, 3 different attributes in it. And that's where Fixture Factory gets in. So Fixture Factory lets us generate a factory. So we can say, Fixture Factory dot register. Let's call it a user or a contact, maybe contact, right? And we can say, okay, so we have these contacts that look like this, right? And it has Faker built in, so we don't actually need to use Faker directly here. And we can leave off Faker from these method calls. In fact, they're not even method calls. Look at that. Hang on a sec. So that's close. So with Fixture Factory, right, we can define different factories. So here I'm defining a factory called contact. And I'm saying a contact has these 3 attributes, and I want to use these Faker methods to generate values for those attributes. And then later on, I can say, I can use that factory to generate lots of those things. So if I want to generate a list of contacts, like the ones I'm passing to add contact, I can replace this whole array with just Fixture Factory dot generate contact. And I can generate 5 of them. And that will automatically generate an array of contacts that all have these properties, and they're all sort of like randomly created. If I run these tests, it should look very similar. No, did I lose my logging? I did, I lost my logging. Okay, logging back in. All right, so we're still getting this sort of like big array of contacts, and underneath the hood, Faker's being used to generate the values, right? But Fixture Factory is giving this nice syntax where I can just sort of declare like, hey, contacts always look like this. And then I have these nice helper functions that'll help me like, okay, generate 5 contacts. And then it gets really easy in here if I want to, you know, load test this thing, like, well, what happens if I try and pass in 500 contacts? And it'll just generate all that for me. I don't have to hard code it into my test file. And I'll have like 100 unique contacts with realistic looking data. So that's where Fixture Factory comes in. Is it's basically giving you some methods built around Faker where Faker is letting you generate, realistic fake data, but everything that Faker gives you is a string of some type, right? It's an address or a zip code or a name. But if you want to generate whole objects with lots of attributes nested, you can use fixture factory for that. That's kind of the idea there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Cool.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then Factory Girl, I probably won't go all the way into here, but Factory Girl is very much like Fixture Factory, in that it allows you to do this sort of thing where you define some model, say, right? Like we defined a contact, and over here in the examples are defining a user, and you say these are the attributes that model has, and these are the ways we're going to default the values of that model when we create one. And Factory Girl just adds in this layer where it will not only create instances of those objects for you or lists of them, but you can tell it to like create them and store them in the database. So you can sort of link, like if we had a contacts table, Factory Girl would let us sort of link this contact model to a table in the database, so that when we say Factory Girl.create, which is their version of generate, it'll actually like return those objects to us to use in the test, but it will also store them in the database. So before your test, you can sort of set things up by like sticking stuff in the database. So the natural evolution of Fixture Factory once you start dealing with database-backed models. Cool. Does that answer both of your bullet points, or was there something else in the second question you added in the list here that you wanted to get to?
It kind of answers my first one. I was more interested in the second part of seeing you actually maybe kind of write something like Fixture Factory, like maybe a function that generates these type of objects.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, Fixture Factory, and this is something that you'll probably see commonly in tests. This Fixture Factory is nice, but sometimes you'll just, in a test suite. So let's say we just got rid of this stuff here. Say we weren't using, well, let's go back to this. All right. Let's go back to so we go back to the Faker version of this file, right? If we weren't going to use Fixture Factory, it really wouldn't be terribly hard to roll our own thing on top of Faker, right? We could come down here and just in our test, we could define some function and call it generate contact. Uh-oh. So we can create our own sort of generator here. And just return an object that uses Faker to put data in there. And then this whole thing can be changed to a bunch of calls to generate contact, right? So kind of works the same way, right? Just put the log back in there.
Oh, so it's really that simple.
Yeah, it's a lot of this stuff is, a lot of these libraries aren't doing a lot of magic. Of course, there's a lot of features they add on to, but yeah, it's that simple. And if you wanted to go all the way and say, well, what if I wanted to generate some number of contacts, right? What if I wanted to generate contacts function that just takes a number, like a count, that turns out to be pretty easy as well. you can just and in fact, I feel like there's a, hang on a second, because I'm Indian array. I know there's an easy way to do this in JavaScript. Array from is array, array of, array, where's the constructor defined in here? Create an array. Array length, yeah. So we could say new array 5 map something like that. And then we could change this whole thing here to generate contacts 5. I hard-coded 5 in here. That's not what I want. Let's see if that works. Chances are I got that wrong. 5 empty items. Phooey. Well, I may be using this array constructor wrong. So I don't know, there's probably a fancy way to do this, but the unfancy way to do it is just
OS 10 includes a built-in screen reader called VoiceOver.
Let's see, const result. You know, you could just do the old for each, right? Where you for I equals 0, I is less than count, I plus plus. Always feels like just giving up to use a real for loop, but sometimes push. Boom. Something like that. That should work. There we go. So there you've got your own sort of little factory generator, right, to generate contacts. And that's pretty common. And even when you're using these, you know, built-in, not built-in, but these like pre-made modules, right, for like Factory Girl or Fixture Factory or those types of things, a lot of times you still end up having to write some test helpers in your test, little functions in your test to help you generate data where, you know, you may need to generate a bunch of objects that sort of play together. And sometimes you still have to kind of write your own helper functions for that, even if those helper functions and then calling factory functions from modules that you've brought in, like you, you know, so imagine you were writing tests for the Echo software, right? So we've got chapters and we've got a bunch of learner objects in the database and curriculum and modules and all this stuff. And so you might have some factory function that just spins up like a sample data representing an entire guild chapter, right? That's got, you know, 15 users and 4 phases. And, you know, you could, you might end up creating your own test function that was like build guild chapter that just took some arguments like learner count, chapter name. I don't know, like a few different arguments like that then you feed into a bunch of factory functions that like create all your backend objects for you. Does that help a little bit?
Yes, that's awesome.
Okay, very cool. Latoya, you've been quiet. Do you have a question? Or you just logged in but not actually listening? Which is fine too.
I think she might have went to the restroom.
Gotcha. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I guess I will wrap up then.
I'm good. Thanks, man. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to help. Have a good afternoon.
You too.